The bell above the diner's door chimed softly, its familiar jingle blending with the low hum of conversation and the faint sizzle of bacon on the griddle. Ethan glanced up from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a rag, just in time to see the old man step inside. Like clockwork, he came in every morning at exactly 7:30. Neatly dressed in a pressed suit and tie, a few military medals gleaming on his chest, his silver hair combed back with meticulous care. He walked with a slow, measured pace, his cane tapping lightly against the tiled floor, but his posture remained upright, proud, unyielding, as if he were still standing in formation. He moved toward the corner booth, the one tucked near the window, as he always did. No hesitation. No scanning for other seats. As if that particular spot was his by right, untouched and waiting. Ethan knew him, at least in the way any restaurant owner knows a regular. He was Frank, 97 years old. A war hero, according to the rumors. And alone. Always alone. Maria, the head waitress, had already placed a coffee cup on the table before Frank even sat down. She smiled at him warmly, like she always did, but he never returned it. Not because he was rude, he was polite, always polite, but because he never seemed to really be there. His hands, steady despite their age, reached for the menu, though he didn't need to. "The usual, Mr. Frank?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. And make sure the eggs aren't runny." Maria scribbled the order down, but Ethan knew she didn't have to. It never changed. 2 plates. 2 coffees. 1 untouched. Ethan watched from behind the counter, arms crossed over his chest. The diner was his, built from years of sweat and sacrifice, but he had a habit of watching people, piecing together their stories. And Frank was a mystery that didn't quite fit. He never missed a day. Not through snowstorms, heavy rain, or the blistering summer heat. And yet, no one ever came with him. No family. No friends. Just 2 plates, 2 coffees, and a quiet conversation with someone who wasn't there. Today was no different. Frank sat in silence, his gaze flickering between the steaming plate in front of him and the empty seat across the table. Then, almost imperceptibly, his lips moved. Not in prayer. Not in idle muttering. In conversation. Ethan's stomach tensed. It wasn't the first time he had noticed it, but today, standing just a few feet away, he could hear it. Soft. Measured. As if Frank were responding to someone speaking just as quietly. Maria passed by, setting a fresh pot of coffee on the counter. Ethan glanced at her, lowering his voice. "You ever notice that?" he murmured. She didn't look up as she wiped down a tray. "Notice what?" "The way he talks to himself." Maria's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before she resumed cleaning. She exhaled, a barely there sigh. "He's been doing that since before I started working here," she said. "And that was 10 years ago." Ethan frowned. 10 years. Maria nodded. Every single day. Same time, same seat, same order. And always... She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Always for 2. The word sent a ripple through Ethan's chest. He turned back toward the booth, watching as Frank picked up his fork, taking slow, deliberate bites. Across from him, the second plate remained untouched, the eggs growing cold. The rest of the diner moved around him, but Frank sat still, apart from it all. Alone in a world only he seemed to understand. Ethan had seen grief before. He had watched old widowers sit across from empty chairs, had seen mothers stir coffee in silence, their eyes hollow from loss. But this was different. This was ritual. And rituals were hard to break. As the hours passed, the diner emptied. The lunch crowd came and went, and by early afternoon only a few stragglers remained, an elderly couple near the entrance, a young woman reading by the window, and Frank, still in his corner. It was almost time for him to leave. Ethan knew his routine by heart. He always lingered after his meal, as if waiting for someone. And when no one came, he would sigh, stand, and carefully fold his napkin. But today, something was different. As Ethan wiped down the counter, he saw it. The napkin, left behind on the table, and something underneath it. Frowning, He stepped out from behind the counter and made his way to the booth. The coffee cups were empty. The second plate remained untouched, as always. And there, half hidden beneath the neatly folded napkin, was a small, worn photograph. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. The edges were frayed, the surface slightly yellowed with time. The image was black and white, two young men in uniform, their arms slung around each other, grinning. Their faces were full of life, of camaraderie, of something Ethan couldn't quite name. Turning the photo over, he found faded ink scrawled across the back. "Brothers in arms. Forever." A chill ran down his spine. He looked back toward the door, but Frank was gone. And for the first time since Ethan had known him, the old man had left something behind. Ethan turned the photograph over in his hands, his thumb tracing the worn edges. The ink on the back, faded but still legible, sent a chill through him. "Brothers in arms. Forever." Frank had never left anything behind before. Not a napkin, not a single coin in change. It was as if each meal was part of a carefully rehearsed act, something precise and deliberate. But today, something had shifted. Ethan glanced toward the door, half expecting to see Frank's figure returning, realizing his mistake. But the old man was gone, vanished into the rhythm of the afternoon just as he always did. Only now, a piece of his past remained. Maria walked past with a tray of dishes, pausing when she saw Ethan standing by the empty booth. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated before handing her the photo. She studied it for a long moment, her brow creasing. Then, she let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh. "I've seen this before," she murmured. Ethan's eyes sharpened. "Where?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the kitchen. "Come with me." In the break room, Maria rummaged through her purse before pulling out an old newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it carefully, placing it on the small table between them. Ethan leaned in, his eyes scanning the headline. "Local Veteran Honors Fallen Friend in Unbreakable Ritual." His stomach twisted as he read. The article was dated over 40 years ago. It spoke of two young soldiers, Frank and Charlie, childhood friends who had enlisted together, shipped off to war side by side. The details were sparse, but the message was clear. They had made a pact. If they made it home, they'd have breakfast together every morning for the rest of their lives. A promise made in the trenches, under fire, when death was just a breath away. But only Frank had returned. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the story settling over him like a thick fog. "So that's what this is," he murmured. "He's keeping a promise." Maria nodded. "Every day, for decades." Her voice softened. "And he's always alone." Ethan sat back, the photo still clutched in his fingers. He imagined it. Two young men, barely more than boys, standing side by side in the chaos of war, making promises they truly believed they'd keep. How many times had Frank looked across this very table, seeing not an empty seat, but a memory? Something about it gnawed at him. "Charlie never came home," Ethan said, more to himself than Maria. "But why now? Why leave this behind after all these years?" Maria shook her head. "Maybe he's forgetting things. Maybe he's getting tired." Ethan frowned. The Frank he knew, stoic, deliberate, didn't seem like the type to forget. And if he was tired, it wasn't the kind that sleep could fix. He made up his mind. The next morning, when Frank walked in, Ethan was ready. The diner was quiet, the usual morning rush not yet in full swing. Frank moved to his booth, easing into the seat with careful precision. His hands were steady as he reached for the menu, though he never truly needed it. Ethan wiped his palms against his apron and approached. Instead of the usual small talk, he slid the photograph onto the table. Frank froze. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his gaze locked on the image. His jaw clenched, his fingers curling slightly against the table's surface. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, not startled, but assessing. "Where did you find this?" His voice was low, measured. Ethan kept his tone gentle. "You left it yesterday." Frank didn't respond right away. He picked up the photo carefully, turning it over, reading the words on the back as if seeing them for the first time. After a moment, he exhaled. "I was wondering where this went." Ethan hesitated, then sat across from him. "I read the article." Frank's gaze flickered, but he didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired. "I made him a promise," Frank murmured. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it, something vast and unspoken. "We were supposed to come home together. Have breakfast every morning, like we always did when we were kids." Ethan didn't interrupt. He could feel the shift in the air, the past pressing against the present. Frank's fingers tightened around the edges of the photo. "Charlie was the best of us. Smarter. Faster. Always had some joke lined up, even when we were in the worst of it. But that day—" He trailed off, his throat working. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" Frank's gaze dropped to the tabletop. "Ambush. Middle of nowhere, deep in enemy territory. We weren't supposed to be there, but orders are orders." His voice grew quieter. "I hesitated. Just for a second. But that's all it took." Silence stretched between them. Frank's grip on the photo never loosened. "He pushed me out of the way. Took the hit that was meant for me. And I had to leave him behind." His voice cracked, just slightly, before he cleared his throat. "They wouldn't let me go back for him." Ethan swallowed hard, the image forming in his mind. Charlie, young and full of life, making a split-second decision that cost him everything. And Frank, living with it every single day. "That's why you come here," Ethan said softly. "Why you always order 2 plates." Frank nodded once. "A promise is a promise." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. Decades. Frank had carried this weight for decades, keeping a seat open for someone who never got the chance to return. For the first time since they'd met, Frank looked directly at him. Not past him, not through him, but at him. "But lately, I don't know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Some days, it feels like he's really here. And other days—" He exhaled, shaking his head. "Other days, I wonder if I'm just chasing ghosts." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. But as he sat there, watching the old soldier stare at the empty plate across from him, he knew one thing for certain. Frank had spent a lifetime keeping a promise. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone else to keep one for him. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. Frank had carried his grief alone for too long, wrapped in the quiet repetition of routine, but that weight was no longer invisible. It was there in the way his shoulders sagged just slightly more each day, in the way his voice grew softer when speaking of the past, in the way his eyes lingered on an empty seat that would never be filled. Ethan wasn't sure what he could do, but he knew one thing. No one should bear that kind of burden alone. When the diner door chimed at exactly 7:30, Ethan was already waiting. Frank entered as he always did, methodical in his movements, nodding politely to Maria before making his way to his usual booth. But today, Ethan didn't stay behind the counter. Instead, he carried the 2 plates to the table himself, setting one down in front of Frank and, for the first time, the other in front of himself. Frank hesitated. His brow furrowed, deep lines creasing his forehead as he looked at Ethan, his fingers tightening around the handle of his cane. "What are you doing?" Ethan sat down. "Keeping you company." Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something unreadable, something guarded. His gaze dropped to the plate of food, identical to his own. The same breakfast he had ordered for decades. The second plate had always been there, untouched, a tribute to someone long gone. But now, for the first time, someone sat across from him. "I don't need company," Frank said, his voice steady but lacking its usual sharpness. Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you should be alone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner bustled around them, waitresses moving between tables, the scent of fresh coffee weaving through the air. But in that small corner, it felt as though time had slowed. Frank exhaled through his nose, setting his napkin neatly across his lap. He didn't protest again, didn't tell Ethan to leave. Instead, He picked up his fork and took a measured bite, chewing in silence. Ethan did the same, letting the quiet settle between them. Minutes passed, and then, so softly it almost went unheard, Frank spoke. "He always talked too much," he murmured, his eyes distant. "Charlie. Couldn't sit through a meal without running his mouth about something. Drove me crazy sometimes." Ethan took a sip of coffee, watching him carefully. "Sounds like he kept things interesting." Frank's lips twitched in something that was almost a smile. "That's one way to put it." His grip on his fork loosened. "I used to tell him he'd talk himself into trouble one day. He told me I worried too much." His fingers tapped absently against the table. "But I was right." Ethan didn't have to ask. The story had already unfolded between them, piece by piece. The war. The ambush. The decision that changed everything. Frank looked down at his plate. "I think about that day more than I should. More than is good for me." Ethan set his fork down. "Maybe. But you've honored him every day since." Frank was quiet for a moment, then let out a breath, one that sounded heavier than all the others before it. "I used to believe he was still with me. That as long as I kept that seat open, he wasn't really gone." He exhaled again, staring at the empty spot across from him. "But the older I get, the harder it is to tell what's memory and what's just me wanting something that isn't there." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Frank, what if it's not about keeping the promise anymore?" Frank's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ethan chose his words carefully. "You've spent your whole life honoring Charlie, keeping him close in the only way you knew how. But maybe it's not about looking back anymore. Maybe it's about letting people in now." Frank didn't respond right away. He stared at the table, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he set his fork down and straightened in his seat. "When I was young," he said, voice low, "I used to think of time as a debt. Something I owed. Every extra day I got was a day Charlie didn't, and that meant I had to live it for the both of us." He looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze. "But that's not living, is it?" Ethan shook his head. "No, it's not." Frank's fingers hovered over the edge of the plate, as if considering something unseen. Then, without a word, he reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Not heavy, not full of ghosts. Just quiet. Comfortable. Maria passed by, hesitating at the sight of Ethan seated across from Frank. She arched a brow but said nothing, only offering a knowing smile before refilling their cups. Frank watched her go, then exhaled through his nose. "You gonna make this a habit?" Ethan smirked. "Guess that depends on whether you're planning to keep that seat open." "For the first time in a long time," Frank chuckled. It was small, barely more than a breath, but it was real. He picked up his fork again, shaking his head. "Damn kid," he muttered. Ethan just smiled. And for the first time in decades, the second plate wasn't just for someone who wasn't there.